Always start off with a bit of Latin for a medical audience. I know you speak it in your consultations. All right, that's a statue which stands on the staircase of the zoology department at the University of Edinburgh, which is where I did my undergraduate degree and my PhD, and it shows a picture of a rather puzzled-looking chimpanzee with a human skull in its hand, sitting on a pile of books. One of those books has got Darwin on the cover, and if you look at the open page of another one, it has the three words Eretis Sicut Deus. Now, we all know what that means, of course, I'm sure. That's translated in the King James Version of the Bible as, "Ye shall be like gods, knowing of good and evil." And it's what the serpent says to Eve when the serpent persuades her to eat the forbidden fruit. She'll know of good and evil. And just to put in, you see, we are told that we have to put in commercial breaks every 10 minutes, just to put in a commercial break. My new book, which is called The Serpent's Promise, which is an attempt to rewrite the Bible as if it were a scientific textbook, comes out on May the 2nd. But I'm not going to talk about that particularly. Now, in fact, this notion that we should be like gods, knowing of good and evil, is very hard to disentangle from genetics. All the way from its beginnings of human genetics, it seemed to have an agenda that it will tell us things which are very close to our very being. It will tell us things even about good and evil, possibly, as we'll hear perhaps towards the end of this brief talk, but it will certainly tell us about our maladies, our illnesses, maybe our talents, our musicality, our abilities in sport, in education. All these things somehow are supposed perhaps to live within the genes. And that's what I want to explore. And I hope I'll be able to persuade you that far from separating top down and bottom up, it's actually impossible. They are, in fact, the same thing. I start my first year genetics lectures at UCL, which now have 520 students in every lecture, and I have to hear everyone twice, which is a big bore for them as much as for me, by asking the students to look to the person to their left and the person to their right. And you might like to do that, okay? And I tell them with some accuracy that 2 out of the 3 of them will die for reasons connected with the genes they carry. They look a bit glum at that. But then I say, really quite accurately, cheer up. Had I been speaking in Shakespeare's time, 2 out of 3 of you would be dead already. And here are the figures, okay? Here are the figures. Every million children born, how many made it to 21? 1601, that's Shakespeare's time, 1 in 3. 1801, just before Darwin was born, a bit more than 1 in 2. 2001, 2013, about 99%, okay? And of course, in those days, people died from cold, from cholera, from starvation, from violence, most of which have gone away. But of course, we all have to die in the end. But now we die from what is sometimes called, I believe, the enemy within, which is the DNA. We die from things like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, all of which have got a strong inherited component. Now, what the question really is, what does that mean, and what does that actually tell us about what we should do with the new understanding which is coming from genetics? Should we look at the genes and decide what to do with the patient, or should we look at the patient and forget the genes? Now, bottom up or top down? Well, here's the guy who started it all off. This is Francis Galton, stern-looking Victorian character. When he died in 1911, he left the large sum of money to UCL to found what was the Galton Laboratory, now been given a silly new name, which I will not dignify by repeating. Galton was Charles Darwin's cousin, and he was a remarkable man. He was interested overwhelmingly in human quality. He was interested in human health, human abilities, the ability to in sport. He even made a beauty map of Great Britain based on scoring the local females on a 5-point scale from attractive to repulsive. The low point was in Aberdeen, you'd learn to know, and the high point was where it still is, in South Kensington. Now that sounds a bit silly. But in fact it wasn't. You can do it. I've tried to get my students, both male and female, to do it, but they won't do it because they're too politically correct. But it tells you something about human qualities, maybe about inborn human qualities. And Galton was a great enthusiast for making political use of what he thought he knew about genetics. He certainly did some very valuable work. He was the first person ever really to work out the patterns of inheritance of any human character. This is a diagram made in the 1870s of the similarity between the heights of parents and the heights of children. And actually, Galton invented the word regression. Okay? He found a similarity between the heights of parents and the heights of children, and he suggested that it was, in fact, inherited. And to a certain considerable extent, in fact, he is in fact right. So it's not quite so clear what that means. Here is a comment from his cousin, which should be tattooed on the arm of every geneticist, perhaps of every doctor. It's a wonderful comment. Ignorance more frequently breeds confidence than does knowledge. So if you don't know anything, this is like pre-evidence-based medicine. If you don't know anything, you can be completely confident, because no piece of information is getting in the way of your beliefs. And that's particularly true without question of the study of genetics. From its beginning onwards, we all know, of course, about the Human Genome Project. And it was a remarkable process. It took 15 years or so, almost £1 billion, hundreds of scientists, massive technological developments, and huge expectations were raised. Here's Tony Blair and Bill Clinton on the first of several celebrations of the alleged completion of the Human Genome Project. They like to have their completions. I think they had 5 of them altogether. This information will promote discoveries that will reduce the burden of disease, improve health around the world, and enhance the quality of life for all humankind. Well, ignorance and confidence went together, and here's a comment from what's happening here? Oh, this one. Here's a comment from this week's Nature Genetics, this month's Nature Genetics, a long review of the effects that the Human Genome Project is going to have on medicine. Genomics has become a mainstay of biomedical research. Improvements in effectiveness of healthcare cannot realistically be expected in the coming decade. So clearly, the more we know, the less confident we have become, at least in the world of science and of genetics, perhaps not in the wider world. Where are we here? Okay. What we need to know, what we need to understand is, what do we mean when we say that something is genetic? Okay. Is it a straightforward cause and effect process? Many people think that it is. There was at one time a feeling that all human attributes, including not just medical conditions, but social properties as well, were due to, in inverted commas, bad genes. People still believe that there are single genes for all kinds of attributes. If you type into Google the phrase "scientists find the gene for," you get a sample of 38,000 hits, some of which are accurate: cystic fibrosis, sickle cell disease, and so on. But lots of them are slightly odd: emotional memory, short sleepers, religiosity, sweet tooth, weight gain, premature ejaculation. I'm not sure how that one stays in. And it just goes on and on and on and on. Feeling that somehow we are the slaves of our DNA. And that's what I really want to explore. In fact, the most dangerous word in genetics, without question, is the triplet code FOR, the gene for this, the gene for that. Because that statement has no meaning. Genes only have a meaning when placed in the environment in which they find themselves. And that's, I think, the point I'll try to make in this talk. That if you try to take a bottom-up approach, that you've got the gene for this, the gene for that, we've sequenced the DNA, we've solved the problem, you will find yourself in deep, deep trouble very, very quickly. Okay. A word I will use, I won't describe it in detail, is the word heritability, which has a formal definition, which I won't bore you with. But heritability is the proportion of the total variation in a population which is due to genetic variation. Let me point out that's in the population. Okay. So it's a ratio of genetic variation to the total amount of variation. And that contains both gene and environment. So heritability, the level of heritability of a particular character, depends on both the genes involved and the environment in which they're placed. And you cannot separate them. It's a ratio. You cannot separate them. And that's really absolutely crucial, as we'll see in a moment. In fact, what's happened, people have begun to realize this, there's a new science that's begun to appear called epigenetics. That, I believe, is the Greek for "we have no idea what's going on." In other words, if you don't understand it, it's epigenetics. And here's a diagram I got from a psychiatric genetics journal, which is really in a very complicated and silly way, showing that we don't know what's going on. You've got nature, nurture, gene environment, prenatal environment, adoption, immigration, living conditions for psychiatric and so on. So in other words, it's a mess, okay? And let's talk perhaps a couple of cases where it's turned out to be a mess. Surprisingly enough, one of the biggest cases in which it's turned out to be a mess has been in the attribute which Galton studied, which doesn't have any particular medical implications, doesn't have any particular political or social implications, and that's human height. And human height is, without question, highly heritable. Thousands and thousands of paradoxal pairs have been studied, and about 80% of the total variation is due to genetic variation. That's a high heritability, 0.8. Okay, so off we go. We take the Human Genome Project, and what we can do now is, of course, quite astonishing. It took 15 years to do the first human genome, huge amounts of work. Now, with the new next-generation sequencing, you can do a complete human genome more or less in a day for around £1,000. Okay, and that's been done. And there's a thing called the GIANT Consortium, which has studied the genetics, the DNA changes in relation to height in 180,000 people. Okay, so that's quite a big piece of work. And it brings up two things, really. First of all, that in a few very rare cases, the bottom-up process actually works. Genetics has always been the science of the extremes. So the people who are remarkably tall or extraordinarily short frequently have shifts, changes in a particular gene, a growth hormone gene, or a pituitary growth factor gene, or a gene that alters the arms and lengths. And that's straightforward, but that's rare. The general picture is much, much more complicated. Here we have the world's smallest adult woman, who's an Indian lady called Jyoti Amge, and she's 62.8 centimeters tall, a little bit bigger than a big bottle of Coca-Cola. Then on the right, we've got Sultan Kuzin, who's in the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's tallest man, and he's 251 centimeters tall. And each of those has a fairly well understood genetic, as inherited, a fairly well understood genetic mutation. Okay, but that's rare. Here, there's the normal population height, and here's what we actually get. They found that people were looking at this huge survey. The last count is actually about 200 genes, different genes, that had an effect on human height. Okay. Altogether, they explain only about 15% of the total variation. Now, that's with 200 genes. So we might need 1,000 genes, or 2,000 genes, out of the 23,000 genes that we've got to understand the total set of variation in human height. And that's been very, very shocking, that's the only word for it, really. The discovery that with this extraordinary technology, we're not finding the genes for the most heritable human attribute that we know, which is height. Okay? I actually call these genes, having never caught on, I call them McCavity genes. The evidence is there, the crime has been done, but the criminal has disappeared. And that's happening again and again and again. It's getting much worse, actually, in the last few months, because until a year or so ago, people were using rather indirect ways of looking at DNA, marker points along the DNA. But with the latest technology, you can actually just read the whole thing off from left to right, and a great number of supposed genetic causes for conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder have simply gone away when you look harder at these supposed genes. They're not there. So McCavity's not there. So what are we going to, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us, actually, that the nature-nurture argument is actually rather uninteresting. The bottom-up, top-down argument is rather uninteresting. We know that, that human height has got a lot of heritability, but we're not finding the genes. Why that is by no means clear. But of course, the fact that it's got a lot of heritability doesn't alter the fact that it's open to environmental change, which it most certainly is. You can see that again and again. You can see, for example, this is the mean height of men and women in Britain over the last 40 years or so, and it's gone regularly upwards. Okay, the genes haven't changed. Of course they haven't. The environment has changed. I, as I mentioned, went to university in Edinburgh, which is a marvellous place apart from the weather. I almost said the weather and the Scots, but I won't say that. There might be some here. Okay. And when I was a student at Edinburgh, which is a marvellous place to be a student, almost as marvellous as Waterloo, in fact, Scottish men were on the average about half a centimetre shorter than English men. Last year, Scottish men are now 2 centimetres shorter than English men. Okay? And within Scotland itself, there are great differences in height. If you go to Glasgow, people, men in the poorest district of Glasgow, which is called Colton, are 5 centimetres shorter on the average than men from the richest suburb of Glasgow, which is called Lindsay. There was a time, when I was a student, when you used to see some little fella come strutting into the pub, and then you say, "Oh my God, there's a poisoned dwarf." And this was a Glaswegian from Colton. They're always rather aggressive. Okay, and that had nothing to do with genetics. Of course, it had everything to do with food, with stress and the like. Now, that might seem rather trivial, but actually, there's a 28-year difference in life expectancy today between the men born in inner-city Glasgow, Colton, and those born in Lindsay, 5 miles away. So that's got nothing to do with genetics. Okay? That's a huge, spectacular, extraordinary difference, which has got everything to do with the environment, and is manifest not only in life expectancy, but in height, in depression, in a whole series of different illnesses. So again, the fact that a thing is genetic is not important. What kills them off? Well, one of the things that kills them off, and that's true more and more, okay? Here we have, I won't bore you with the details, a table for a recent paper, not that recent, I should get a more recent one, a table for a recent paper which has been looking for the genes for, in inverted commas, various medically important attributes, cholesterol levels, early onset heart problems, glucose levels, and you'll see the heritability, proportion heritability explained, apart from an age-related blindness, is really very trivial. We're not finding the genes. The question is, what does that matter, and what are we going to do about it? What kills a lot of these people? A lot of people in places like Glasgow? Well, the answer is, of course, obesity. I've talked about height, so I'll talk briefly about weight. Now, Britain has many, many things to be proud of, and I'm very proud to be British. We are, for example, the second most unequal country in Europe after Portugal. So we really pat ourselves on the back for that. And we come top for being the fattest country in Europe by quite a long way. And in fact, Wales and Scotland, Wales does even better where I come from, but Scotland does pretty well too in obesity. And obesity, of course, kills people off. Now, as a result, we've got a lot of interest in the genetics of obesity. People tend to think that if you could unpick the nature and the nurture, the gene and the environment of obesity, you may be able to start dealing with the problem. Now, you can't do that. To unpick it, you'd have to unbake the cake, as it were. You can't slice it into a bit that's called nature and a bit that's called nurture. And here's somebody about to unbake cake by digesting it. Well, what happens if you do that too often? Well, you become obese. And as we all know, there has been a considerable epidemic of obesity in the very recent past. I'll walk you through some slides from the US, which between 1985 and 2010, I think, the proportion of people who are more than 30 pounds overweight, which is a lot for a 5'4" person, roughly speaking, the mean height of a woman, a bit less actually. Okay, so in 1985, very few states had frequencies of more than 10%. But as we go through the years, 1987, the darker it gets, the worse the story gets. Okay, so let's pause at 1999. Now we get into quite a lot of states which have got more than 15%. Carry on going. 2004. Okay. That's the second Bush presidency. Texas does remarkably well, as you can see there. 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, pretty spectacular, I think you'll agree. Okay, and that tsunami of lard actually crossed the Atlantic in about 1980. And so obesity, which is a big health problem, is really rather new, both in the US and here. Now, again, like height, it's got nothing to do with genes. It's got everything to do with the environment. It's got everything to do with the fact that food and so on got much cheaper. Obesity certainly runs in families. Here's an American family, I would say, with 2 morbidly obese parents and an obese daughter. So it runs in families, that's for sure. Here, on the other hand, is a picture of their cat. One of those little known facts of modern science, which isn't that true. That fat people have fat cats, fat dogs, fat goldfish, and the effect is striking and highly significant. Why is that? They don't share genes with their cats, but they do share an environment in the sense that they overeat themselves and they overfeed their pets. Okay, so that seems to be a straightforward environmental effect. Here, on the other hand, is a picture of a fat mouse. Okay. And this is a mouse which has got a genetic condition. It's lacking a particular hormone. It's called the obese mutant for obvious reasons. It lacks a particular hormone. I'll come back to in a moment. It was discovered, it appeared, it must be nearly 20 years ago now in laboratory stocks, and it was in the days when people were still patenting genes. This gene was patented, was sold for millions of dollars to people who assumed that they could build some kind of slimming pill based on this mutation. Well, I can tell you that nothing like that happened. What's happened with this mouse is that it's got an error in the ability to make a particular hormone that's called leptin. It's a protein hormone, and similar effects are actually found in humans. Here's a young lad born with leptin deficiency on the left there, and after leptin treatment, you can see indeed his considerable obesity has disappeared. So you might say that's actually genetic, and in some senses, without question, it is. Now, we now know the way the leptin system works, and it's really quite rather unexpected. It's actually an appetite hormone, okay? And it's one of several hormones which control the extent to which you become hungry. And where was the first hormone discovered? Not King's College London, University College London, 1903. Okay, that was a secretin, which is also a digestive hormone. But we now know, of course, there are many, many hormones which do all kinds of wonderful things, including telling you when to pick up your knife and fork, you're hungry, okay? And perhaps less obviously, when to put it down, you're satiated. And leptin is one of the ones, one of the several ones, that actually tells you when to put your knife and fork down. You've had 2 cheeseburgers, that's enough, you don't want a fork. Okay, and this young lad, he hasn't got any, is genuinely starving all the time. He really thinks he's hungry, and it's very difficult to control. Well, another related gene was found later that it turns out, unlike the leptin story, it turns out not to be one of the rare and extreme cases, like, shall we say, Sutter-Curzin, one birth in 10,000 or fewer. It actually affects most of us. Here's what's called a Manhattan plot, and for those of you who don't know, I'll just remind you what these things are. A Manhattan plots are so called because what you do is you take the 22 chromosomes over the X and Y, it's not longer, and you line them up at the bottom, and you read along the DNA with particular marker points on it. And you take a whole bunch of people who, shall we say, have got schizophrenia, and another whole bunch of people who don't have schizophrenia. And these are big sample sizes, many thousands in some cases. And you ask, is it the case that those with, shall we say, schizophrenia have got particular variants, which then rise up in frequency on your plot, whereas those who don't have those variants. And the idea was that the plot would look like the skyline of Manhattan. Okay, you have skyscrapers of predilection to things like of particular illnesses. Well, it hasn't really worked like that. An awful lot of the Manhattan plots have kind of gone away as the technology gets better and we get more accurate. But oddly enough, the obesity one has actually worked. And it worked with a particular variant called FTO, okay, which is on chromosome 16. You can see that obese people are particularly likely to have a particular variant in this FTO gene. And just to show us how little we understand about genetics, its FTO stands for fused toes. Okay? And it's a gene that when mice have got it, their toes and they're fused together. Mickey Mouse, you notice, has only got 3 fingers on each hand, even though he isn't fat. So he's got a fused toes variant. Bizarrely, that affects human appetite. Now that is bizarre, and I can tell you that happens again and again. You have things that cause the wings of Drosophila to change, which cause cancer in humans, which is very, very strange and scarcely understood. But it's epigenetic, so that's okay. And this is fused toes, and there is a lot of variation in fused toes. About a third or a quarter of the people in this room will have 2 copies of the single DNA letter A at a particular site in the FTO gene. About a third, roughly speaking, will have 2 copies of the letter T, and the others will have 1 of each. And actually, as you see, those of you with 2 copies of the letter A are much more likely to be overweight of those with 2 copies of the letter T. In fact, it's an average difference of about 2 to 3 kilograms, which is quite a lot. And that's an appetite gene. It actually is active in the brain. This is where it's expressed. It's not expressed in the gut. It's not a digestion gene. It's a hunger gene. Okay. So we live, when we think about it, in extraordinary times. We live in the time when, the first time in history, rich people are thin and poor people are fat. And that, of course, is an extreme reversal as to what the human history always was. So why is that? That has happened because, once again, of an environmental change. Food has become effectively free. It doesn't seem like it, but it has. These are the number of hours of work that you have to do to buy a basket of groceries in the US from 1990 to 2007. And you can see the amount of work necessary to buy a decent kind of food which will feed your family for at least a day has gone down by about 5 times. Food is effectively free. So in those circumstances, with an excess of food readily available, often junk food, which is even cheaper, then those with the appetite variance are more likely to become obese than those without. So nature and nurture are actually working together. So again, a statement, it's very hard to separate the two. Let me end up by talking about another of Galton's obsessions, which is actually, you see, coming back into the public discourse again today. When we hear talk about chavs and people who are unable to help themselves and are born lazy, this is exactly Galtonian eugenics. This is precisely what it is. You were born inferior, you can't do anything. This is Galton. It is easy to show, yes, that confidence there, but it is easy to show that criminal nature tends to be inherited. That's some of the composite photographs of burglars, murderers, and so on, which he made. He was pretty ahead of his time. We're talking about 1880 here. And he was honest, too. He couldn't see any differences between the burglars and the murderers. So, okay. Interestingly enough, he was in some ways right. There's a famous study done partly from the Institute of Psychiatry in Kings and also from Cambridge in the London borough of Lambeth rather than Southwark, which asked about criminality, inheritance of criminality. And by far the strongest predictor of criminality for the young boy was if his father had been in prison. He was much, much more likely to go to prison himself. So, of course, it proves, obviously does it not, that it's genetic. Well, you might argue that that's silly, but actually there are some cases where you can fit aberrant behavior to genes. And once again, we have this dichotomy between those very rare bottom-up cases where the genes do what they're going to do, whatever circumstances they're placed in, and the much more common top-down ones, where the environment plays a much larger part. In about 1991, a colleague of mine, and a Dutch geneticist, and he's very well known, I'm sure you've heard this work, was approached in his clinic in Nijmegen in Holland by a young lady who was getting married and wanted to have a family, but she asked, could she have a prenatal diagnosis first? And if she was pregnant with a son, could that pregnancy be terminated? And the immediate answer was obviously no. That seemed to be not found to be ethical. And then Han Brunner asked why that was, and she gave him a family tree she'd worked out. It had to do with an inheritance pattern of crime, violent crime, quite often, in the family. Here we've got males and females, squares and circles, affected males and their mothers. This is clearly, I'm sure you all know about sex linkage, this is clearly a sex-linked attribute, okay? Passed down through females manifests itself much more often in males because males, if they've got an X chromosome, will show anything on it. The gene involved was this, the gene involved in this neurotransmitter here, part of the neurotransmitter chain here, called monoamine oxidase A, okay? And these kids had no monoamine oxidase A It turned out that under those circumstances they were totally unable to control their moods. So that if they were annoyed by somebody or somebody was rude to them, they would just fly off the handle, attack them, beat them up, kick them, get into terrible, burn down their houses, which a couple of them did, and get into terrible trouble. And that clearly is a genetic predisposition to crime. Now, once again, just as in the case of height, there is genetic variation in the activity of this enzyme in the general population. I should warn you, have got rather low levels of monoamine oxidase A deficiency. But once again, nature and nurture are working together. This is a survey which was much criticized because of shortage of data, but now looks considerably better. It has to do with the rate of violent offending, okay, on the vertical axis, in relationship to monoamine oxidase activity. Okay? If you've got very low monoamine oxidase activity, you're at higher risk of offending. Now, the pale blue, the pale blue line are those with high or normal monoamine oxidase activity. The risk percentile group at the bottom is the kind of family they come from. If they come from a nice middle class family, a rather troubled lower class family, or whether they're just chavs, okay? You'll see that even for the pale blues, the incidence of offending goes up if they have a rough time when they're young. But for the dark blues, if they've got very poor monoamine oxidase activity, it goes up much, much more. In fact, it goes up about 16 times. So once again, nature and nurture are working together. Now, people are being shocked by the idea of a gene for crime. But that's completely banal. It is, of course, a gene for crime, and rather fewer than half the people in this room carry it. Here it is. It makes this stuff here. It's a chemical messenger, testosterone. And almost every crime, of course, is carried out much more by men, people with a gene that makes testosterone, than by women. Here's the murder rate by men per million per year, men in red, women in blue. And you can see that men murder like mad at 10 times the rate of women, mainly when they're in their 20s and 30s, when they're trying to prove what a wonderful husband they would make, or eliminate the opposition, and make an occasional grumpy old man with a wife, whatever you can see. And that's a universal phenomenon. It's true in England, it's true in the United States. Here's the murder rate by age in the United States, in Detroit. Okay? Precisely the same, grumpier with age, but exactly the same, 10 times difference. However, look at the vertical axis. The number of murders per year per million in Detroit is about 1,000 at its peak. In England and Wales, it's 25. Okay. So here we've got a statement of the way that nature and nurture always live together. Now, clearly, there is a biological component to this particular unattractive human behavior, as there is a biological component to almost every human condition. Okay? Illness, coronary heart disease, cancer, all included. You can't do anything about that biological component, but you can change the environment. You can get rid of the guns, get rid of the gangs, try and cut down on drugs. So you're changing your nature by altering your nurture. Okay. In some ways, that tells you a little bit about what medicine does with genetics. It uses it as a diagnostic tool to see who's at risk and gets them to change their environment. I was speaking the other day to Steve Humphries, a colleague of mine, who works on cardiovascular genetics. He's interested in familial hypercholesterolemia. And this is a not uncommon condition where you may inherit a particular variant, and there are thousands of people with a variant in Britain, which predisposes it, makes it very hard for you to clear cholesterol, bad cholesterol, from your blood. So it gets laid down in the heart and elsewhere, and you're at high risk of a heart attack. And Steve and other people have picked up numbers of families where somebody's had a heart attack, and they do what's called cascade sampling. They find this woman's brother or sister, check them, check the cousins, check the father, check the children, and they pick up a lot of people, and they advise them what should they do. Well, they tell them the obvious things. Number one, underline 40 times, stop smoking. Number two, lose weight. Number three, take statins. Which are very good for this kind of thing. And obvious and sensible precautions. And they tell people at risk, and the people at risk tend to listen, not as much as you would think. They improve their behavior, their chances by changing their behavior, most of them by only about 25 or 30%, quite a bit. But what's really interesting is that the people they sample who turn out not to have a condition, but who have been told about the condition, they improve their behavior to exactly the same extent, which is bizarre. So what all the genetics is doing is reminding people, if you continue to smoke and to be fat and exercise, you will die young, whatever your genotype is. Okay. So I think that's the take-home lesson of my talk, that bottom up and top down are basically the same thing. So I'll stop there.